Atlantis, legend or a truth, waiting to be unearthed. Prologue, a faint light in the dark ocean. There are stories that never grow old. Stories that survive the fall of empires, that linger even as centuries pile up like forgotten books in an ancient library. They are not bound to one culture or one people. They echo across generations like a half-remembered dream. Atlantis is one such story. A magnificent city, a mighty empire swallowed by the sea in the span of a single day and night. It comes to us not from folklore whispered by wandering sailors, but from the pen of one of history's greatest thinkers, Plato, the philosopher of Athens. In his writings, Atlantis is described with both precision and mythic grandeur, a land of wealth, power, and order, undone by its own arrogance. But was it real? Or was it simply a parable, a carefully constructed lesson wrapped in the robes of imagination? The enigma lies in that uncertainty. Atlantis could be both a warning and a memory, both an invention and a fragment of truth buried beneath waves. And for over 2 millennia, that ambiguity has drawn explorers, scholars, dreamers, and charlatans alike into the labyrinth of the unknown. This is where our journey begins, at the dawn of the legend, with Plato's words. Chapter 1: The Philosopher's Whisper. The first time Atlantis was spoken into existence, it was not whispered by sailors returning from uncharted waters, nor sung by poets who claimed to have seen visions of drowned palaces beneath the sea. It was not scratched on a clay tablet, nor carved into temple walls, nor recorded in the archives of any kingdom. No, the first time Atlantis appeared in human history, it emerged in the imagination of a philosopher. It was the 4th century before Christ, and Athens was a city both magnificent and wounded. The Parthenon gleamed in the sunlight, the marble still white and sharp-edged, not yet eroded by centuries of weather and conquest. Statues of gods and heroes adorned the city, their gazes serene and eternal. The air itself seemed to shimmer with voices, tragedies performed in the theater of Dionysus, debates in the agora, orations in the assembly. From a distance, one could believe Athens was eternal, destined to shine forever. But within its streets, the scars of war and hubris were plain. Athens had been the jewel of Greece, the proud leader of an empire that stretched across the Aegean. Yet pride had brought conflict, and conflict had brought ruin. The Peloponnesian War, nearly 3 decades of blood and famine, of shifting alliances and betrayals, had left Athens humbled before its rival, Sparta. The city's navy, once the envy of the world, was broken. Its treasury was emptied. Its citizens, once so confident, now lived with the knowledge that greatness could be lost. This was the city into which Plato was born, around 428 BCE. He was a child of both glory and decline, a witness to the paradox of Athens. His family was aristocratic, connected to power. As a youth, he might have walked among the colonnades of the academy, studied poetry, and recited Homer as naturally as breathing. But he also would have seen the darker truths, the city's bitter politics, its fragile democracy, its tendency to devour its own. And above all, Plato lived through the death of Socrates. Socrates, his teacher, was a strange figure, barefoot, unkempt, but armed with questions that could unseat the proudest statesman. He was a gadfly, as he called himself, stinging Athens awake. He believed in virtue, in the examined life, in a kind of wisdom that could not be bought or voted into office. For Plato, the young disciple, Socrates must have seemed immortal. Yet Athens, in one of its cruelest ironies, condemned him to death. The charge was corruption of the youth, impiety toward the gods. The real crime was that he had asked too many questions, made too many men uncomfortable. Plato watched, as the city he loved executed the man he admired most. The lesson was searing. Even the greatest civilization can betray its own ideals. Even wisdom can be silenced by arrogance and fear. From that moment, Plato's work would circle around a single obsession: what makes a city just? What makes a civilization endure? And why do they collapse? It is in this atmosphere, Athens licking its wounds, Plato mourning Socrates, the philosopher grappling with the fragility of greatness, that Atlantis first enters the stage. The story appears in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. They are not among Plato's most famous works. They lack the polished drama of the Republic or the moral sharpness of the Apology. But they contain something else, a mystery that has haunted us ever since. Plato does not present Atlantis as invention. He presents it as memory. He claims that the Athenian statesman Solon, centuries earlier, traveled to Egypt, where priests told him of a mighty empire that existed 9,000 years before. An empire vast and wealthy, located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the narrow straits we now call Gibraltar, the edge of the known world. Solon, Plato says, brought the story back to Greece, but never completed its telling. It passed down through his family until it reached Plato himself, who now, at last, sets it down. And what a story Atlantis, we are told, was an island greater than Libya and Asia combined. It was rich in resources, fertile soil, abundant forests, metals gleaming in the earth, even orichalcum, a mythical substance said to shine like fire. Its people were prosperous, skilled in seafaring, masters of canals and harbors. They built a capital city of breathtaking design, concentric rings of land and sea, joined by bridges and guarded by walls that shone with precious metals. At the heart of the city stood a temple to Poseidon, vast and ornate, with statues of gods and chariots carved from gold and ivory. Even elephants roamed its plains, as if nature itself bent to the wealth of this empire. But wealth, as Plato warns, is never safe. The Atlanteans, once noble, grew arrogant. They turned from virtue to greed, from moderation to conquest. Their empire stretched outward, threatening to engulf even Athens. And then came judgment. In a single day and night of misfortune, earthquakes and floods struck, and Atlantis sank beneath the waves. The sea swallowed it, and it vanished forever. The detail of Plato's account is startling. He does not write like a poet spinning fantasy. He writes like a geographer or historian, giving measurements, describing mountains, plains, and harbors. He places Atlantis in a specific location, beyond the pillars of Heracles. He gives us numbers of stadia, distances, sizes, wealth. Enough to tempt us into belief, but never enough to prove. That is the brilliance and the curse of his telling. For if Plato had said clearly, "This is allegory," Atlantis would have ended there. A parable, a metaphor, a footnote in philosophy. If he had insisted, "This is history," its impossibilities would have discredited it. But by leaving it in the liminal space between, he gave birth to an eternal question. Was Atlantis real? And that is why the story endured. Athenians who first read Timaeus and Critias must have felt the sting of recognition. Atlantis, for all its wealth and arrogance, was a mirror of Athens itself, brilliant, ambitious, vulnerable to hubris. The parable was clear. Yet others must have felt the pull of the details, the strange plausibility. Could it be that Plato was preserving some memory of an ancient catastrophe? Had there once been a real city, drowned in flood or fire, remembered dimly by Egyptian priests, now preserved in Greek philosophy? The ambiguity worked like fire in dry grass. The story spread, whispered, debated, reimagined. Sailors gazing westward at the open Atlantic might have wondered if ruins lay just beyond the horizon. Dreamers and poets could imagine palaces beneath the sea. Philosophers could ponder the moral, while storytellers embroidered the legend. Plato, in trying to warn against pride, had created a myth that would outlive his philosophy. He wanted us to remember that civilizations fall when they abandon virtue. Instead, we remembered the city itself, the glittering harbors, the temples, the tragic sinking. We remembered Atlantis. And so it begins not with divers or explorers, not with archaeologists or maps, but with a whisper in the mind of a philosopher in a wounded city, written in dialogues that still glow with the strange light of myth. Atlantis was born not from the sea, but from the tension between truth and story, memory and imagination. It is fitting, then, that the very first lesson of Atlantis is about fragility. Not the fragility of islands alone, but of civilizations, of memory, of truth. Plato knew, better than most, that greatness is never safe. He watched Athens rise and fall, watched wisdom condemned, watched democracy falter. He knew that arrogance was the most seductive poison. And so he gave us Atlantis, a parable dressed as geography, a memory disguised as myth. He could not have known how powerful it would become. For Atlantis would escape him. It would grow far beyond his intentions, adapted and reshaped by every generation that followed. It would become utopia, paradise, obsession, prophecy. It would be claimed by poets, scientists, mystics, politicians. It would inspire voyages, spark books, fuel ideologies, haunt dreams. And always, it would carry the same warning, whether we chose to hear it or not. that pride destroys, that civilizations drown, that memory itself is fragile as sand. But all of that comes later. For now, the story rests in Plato's dialogues, half-told, unfinished. Critias breaks off mid-sentence, leaving the tale incomplete, as if even Plato himself was uncertain how it should end. A mystery, wrapped in philosophy, cast upon the sea of history. Atlantis has not yet sunk. It is only beginning to rise. Chapter 2: A City of Rings and Marble. If the birth of Atlantis begins with Plato's whisper, then its heartbeat lies in his description. For what he gives us is not just an empire in decline, not just a moral tale of arrogance punished, but the vision of a city so vivid that even now, over 2 millennia later, we can almost walk its streets. It is a city that feels alive, suspended in a dream before its destruction, shimmering with marble and metal. It is a place that exists only in words, and yet has lived longer than many real cities of stone. Let us wander there, as if the philosopher's ink were a map, as if the dream had solidity. Let us imagine Atlantis, at the very moment before it fell. The island. First, the island itself, vast, larger than Libya and Asia combined. Plato insists an impossible scale by modern measure, but one that captures the grandeur of his imagination. It lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the great boundary of the Greek world. For the Athenians of Plato's time, the Pillars, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, were the end of knowledge, the threshold between the civilized Mediterranean and the endless mystery of the Atlantic. To say Atlantis lay beyond them was to place it in a liminal realm, half real, half myth, in the space where maps end and monsters begin. The island was fertile, rich in every resource. Broad plains stretched in the center, watered by rivers flowing down from mountains in the north. The soil was deep and black, yielding grain and fruit in abundance. Groves of trees provided timber for ships, temples, and houses. The earth itself was generous, offering metals beyond measure: copper, tin, gold, silver, and that strange, shimmering material called orichalcum, its name derived from mountain copper, yet described as gleaming like fire. To the Atlanteans, it was a substance of prestige, lining their temples, flashing in the sunlight, a reminder that their wealth was born not just of labor, but of the very bones of the earth. Even the animals testified to abundance. Horses were bred for war and sport, herds of cattle roamed the plains, and, most curiously, elephants walked the island. For the Greeks, elephants were exotic, associated with distant lands. To place them in Atlantis was to suggest a richness and variety of life unknown in the familiar Mediterranean. It was a detail meant to persuade. Here was no fantasy, but a land as real as the known world, teeming with creatures men had seen elsewhere. The rings of the city. At the heart of the island stood the capital, a city like no other. Plato describes it with the precision of an architect: concentric circles of land and water, alternating rings carved by both nature and human hand. 3 rings of sea, 2 of land, bound together by bridges and canals. Imagine standing above it, as if on a hill, looking down at the pattern, gleaming water encircling land, then water again, then land, like ripples frozen in marble. Bridges stretched across the channels, wide enough for chariots to cross. Towers guarded each entrance, gates adorned with metals that glinted in the sun. Ships passed through the waterways, sails bright against the blue, while markets and homes clustered along the edges. It was both fortress and harbor, both palace and port. At the very center rose the sacred heart of Atlantis, a great island where the temple of Poseidon stood. The god, father of the Atlantean kings, had once claimed the island, taking the mortal woman Plato as his consort and begetting 10 sons. From these sons came the royal line, each king ruling a portion of the island, all bound to the central city. To honor their divine ancestor, they built a temple vast beyond measure, encased in silver and orichalcum, crowned with pinnacles of gold. Within the temple stood the colossal statue of Poseidon himself, driving 6 winged horses, his trident raised in power. Around him gathered statues of nymphs, gods, and heroes, all wrought in ivory, gold, and precious stone. The walls shimmered, the ceilings dazzled, the very air seemed to vibrate with the presence of wealth. Here, the Atlanteans did not merely worship their god, they flaunted their supremacy. Every glittering surface was a declaration. We are the chosen. We are the masters. We are eternal. The splendor of the plain. Beyond the city stretched the great plain of Atlantis, a vast expanse bordered by mountains to the north and open sea to the south. It was laid out, Plato says, in perfect order, as if the land itself had been measured and designed. 10 kings ruled their territories here, each owing allegiance to the central line, each bound by law to defend the whole. The plain was crisscrossed with canals, straight and wide, designed for irrigation and transport. Every 100 stadia, smaller channels intersected, bringing water to the fields. Crops flourished, orchards thrived, animals grazed. From above, it must have looked like a tapestry of geometry, squares of farmland divided by glittering water, framed by mountains and ocean. It was a utopia of order, wealth, and abundance. Here, the Atlanteans trained their armies as well. Plato speaks of great forces, tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, and a navy beyond imagination. Ships filled the harbors, sleek and powerful, ready to carry war to distant lands. The capital city itself, with its concentric harbors, was designed for this purpose, every ring a dockyard, every channel a naval road. It was as if Atlantis had been built not only for beauty, but for conquest. The illusion of perfection. Reading Plato's description, one feels the seduction of perfection. The city is too ordered, too abundant, too radiant. It gleams with impossible harmony, a balance of nature and human craft. Yet beneath this gleam, Plato plants unease. For this perfection was fragile. The Atlanteans, he says, were once virtuous, guided by divine wisdom, content with moderation. But as generations passed, their divine spark faded. They became greedy, hungry for power, intoxicated by their wealth. They stretched their empire outward, seeking dominion over other lands. Their pride swelled, their virtue withered. And when the gods saw their corruption, they decreed punishment. In a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis fell. Earthquakes shook the land, waves swallowed the city, the great plain disappeared beneath the sea. What had seemed eternal vanished in hours. A memory or a dream? What are we to make of this city? Plato gives us details so vivid, measurements, metals, elephants, harbors, that we are tempted to believe. But the very perfection of Atlantis makes it suspect. No city could be so balanced, so wealthy, so powerful, without cracks. It reads like a dream of order, a fantasy of empire, more than a record of reality. And yet, drowned cities do exist. Earthquakes do strike, floods do consume. The Minoans of Crete, flourishing with art and trade, were undone by the eruption of Thera. The city of Helike, not far from Athens, was swallowed by the sea in Plato's own lifetime. For the Greeks, catastrophe was never distant. To imagine a city destroyed in a single night was not fantasy, it was memory. Perhaps Atlantis is both, a dream shaped from fragments of reality, an allegory built on echoes of truth. A city that never was, and yet always is. The eternal lure. And so, Plato leaves us with a vision both dazzling and haunting, a city of rings and marble, gleaming temples, abundant fields, proud kings, mighty ships. A city too perfect to be real, too plausible to be dismissed. A city that vanished in a night, yet has lived for millennia in imagination. For Atlantis is not just a place. It is a mirror. In its grandeur, we see what we long for: wealth, harmony, abundance. In its fall, we see what we fear: corruption, arrogance, destruction. That duality is why the story survives. We may never find its ruins, but we will always wander its streets in dreams, crossing its bridges, gazing at its temples, hearing the whisper of waves that even now, in imagination, rise to climb it. Chapter 3. Between Allegory and Echo. There is a temptation, when reading Plato's words, to become lost in the glitter. The canals, the elephants, the temple of Poseidon so vivid that they pull us in, as if the philosopher were less a thinker than a cartographer sketching a real place. But before we sink too deep into the dream, we must ask, why was Plato telling this story at all? Plato was not Herodotus, the historian who delighted in strange customs in faraway lands. He was not Homer, spinning epics of gods and heroes. He was a philosopher, concerned with justice, virtue, the ideal forms that exist beyond our imperfect world. His dialogues were never merely stories. They were thought experiments, architecture built with words. Atlantis, then, was not offered as entertainment. It was offered as lesson. The allegory. In Timaeus and Critias, the framing is deliberate. Socrates has asked for an example of a city in action, a living model of the virtues he has been describing. Critias responds with Atlantis, a tale, he says, passed down from Solon, of a city that rose in power, flourished, and then fell through arrogance. The allegory is sharp. Atlantis is not simply a lost island, it is the embodiment of hubris. The Atlanteans began noble, guided by divine heritage, but over generations their virtue eroded. Wealth bred greed, power bred corruption. They turned from moderation to conquest, and in their arrogance, they sought to subjugate Athens itself. The gods punished them. Their empire drowned. To the Athenians, who first heard this tale, the lesson was unmistakable. They had lived through their own hubris. Athens, too, had stretched outward, commanding an empire across the Aegean. Athens, too, had grown arrogant, confident in its navy, intoxicated by power. And Athens, too, had been humbled, defeated by Sparta, its empire shattered, its democracy stained by corruption and blood. Atlantis was not a foreign land. Atlantis was Athens, wearing a mask. If Atlantis is allegory, then it is a warning that no city, however wealthy or powerful, is safe from ruin if it abandons virtue. It is Plato's philosophy dressed in myth, a moral lesson given the shape of marble walls and glittering temples. And yet, the echo of catastrophe. There is something stubborn in Plato's account that resists pure allegory. He does not simply say, "Imagine a city that fell." He insists the story is true, handed down through Solon from Egyptian priests. He gives measurements, geography, details that feel unnecessary for a parable. Why mention elephants? Why describe orichalcum, a metal unknown to Greece? Why speak of harbors, irrigation, armies, and canals? Allegories need not be so precise. And so, many have wondered, was Plato preserving an echo? The Greeks knew catastrophe well. The Mediterranean is a restless stage, where mountains rise, seas swallow, volcanoes roar. In Plato's own lifetime, the city of Helike had been destroyed. One night, in 373 BCE, an earthquake struck the Peloponnesian coast. The ground split, the sea rushed in, and by morning Helike had vanished beneath the waves. Fishermen claimed they could see its ruins on the seafloor. Travelers whispered of temples drowned, statues standing eerily in the water. Plato must have heard these stories. He could hardly have ignored them. Further back in memory lay the eruption of Thera Santorini, centuries before Plato's birth. The island had exploded with a force so vast it reshaped the Aegean. Ash darkened skies, tsunamis struck Crete, and the flourishing Minoan civilization withered. To later Greeks, fragments of that disaster may have lingered in myth, a city destroyed by fire and flood, a civilization humbled by the sea. Could Atlantis be an echo of Thera? And even beyond Greece, across the world, floods haunted memory. Nearly every ancient culture carried tales of deluge. Mesopotamia's Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Noah, the Indian Manu, the Native American flood myths. Always the same shape, humanity flourishing, then punished by water. Was Atlantis another ripple of this universal memory? Plato, weaving allegory, may have drawn upon these echoes, conscious or not. He gave the moral weight of philosophy, but he dressed it in the colors of catastrophe, the details of memory. The result was a story balanced between truth and invention, as if a dream of many ages had passed through him onto the page. Why ambiguity matters. Had Plato declared plainly that Atlantis was a parable, it would have died with him. Philosophical allegories rarely outlive their authors. But by anchoring it in truth, however fragile the claim, he planted a seed of possibility. Had he sworn it was fact, scholars would have refuted it, and it would have faded as disproved history. But he did not. He left it in the twilight space, between half allegory, half memory, half possibility. That ambiguity is precisely why Atlantis has endured when so many other tales have not. The mind does not let go of what if. The double lens. And so, when we look at Atlantis, we must look through two lenses at once. Through the first, we see allegory, Plato warning his city that wealth without virtue is death, that arrogance is always punished. Through the second, we see echo, fragments of real catastrophe, woven into philosophy, preserved in myth. Perhaps the genius of Atlantis is that it works through both lenses simultaneously. As allegory, it teaches. As echo, it lingers. And between them lies the mystery, the hook that has kept us chasing for millennia. A whisper that grew. It is astonishing, when we pause to consider it, how small the birth of Atlantis truly was. Just a few passages, tucked into dialogues that themselves were unfinished. Critias breaks off mid-sentence. The story was never completed. By rights, it should have been forgotten, lost amid Plato's greater works. And yet, it was not. Because it carried more than philosophy. It carried dream, It carried catastrophe. It carried ambiguity. That is why, centuries later, Renaissance explorers would search for the island. That is why poets, mystics, and scientists would write volumes. That is why we, even now, speak of it as if it might still be waiting beneath the waves. The philosopher and the poet. In the end, Plato may not have intended any of this. He was not writing for us, but for his students, for Athens, for the pursuit of truth. And yet, like all great storytellers, he gave us more than he knew. He gave us a city that is both symbol and possibility, allegory and echo, caution and hope. Atlantis is not simply what Plato meant. It is what he unleashed. Chapter 4: Fire and Flood. The sea is patient. It waits, silent and infinite, until the day it chooses to rise. Mountains are no different. They seem immovable, eternal, but beneath their slopes, fire sleeps. Every civilization, sooner or later, learns that the earth is restless. And when it stirs, it does not whisper. It roars. Atlantis, whether allegory or echo, is a story of catastrophe. And catastrophes are not fantasy. They are history. The Mediterranean basin, cradle of so many civilizations, is also a stage for violence, earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions. The ancients knew this well. They lived with the sea as friend and predator, with the ground as home and threat. For them, to imagine a city destroyed in a single night was not mere invention. It was memory. Like the drowned city. Let us begin, not with myth, but with a city Plato could have heard about with his own ears. The year was 373 BCE. Athens was still licking its wounds from war. Plato was in his mid-50s. And not far away, in the region of Achaia, stood the thriving city of Helike. Was prosperous, proud, devoted above all to Poseidon, god of the sea. His cult there was ancient, older than many remembered, and the city carried itself with the confidence of divine favor. But in the winter of that year, the ground began to tremble. Strange signs were reported, animals fleeing, wells drying, the earth whispering warnings. Few listened. Few ever do. Then, one night, the earth convulsed. An earthquake ripped through the city, tearing walls apart, toppling houses. And then came the sea. A massive wave surged inland, swallowing Helike whole. By morning, the city was gone. Where streets and temples had stood, there was only ocean. Fishermen later claimed that, in the clear water, they could still see the ruins on the seabed, columns, statues, houses, silent under the waves. Helike became a cautionary tale across Greece. Travelers spoke of it with awe. Strabo, Pausanias, and other later writers recorded the story. And Plato? He was alive when it happened. He must have heard the whispers, a city destroyed in a night, drowned by the sea, punished perhaps by Poseidon himself. Is it any wonder, then, that when he imagined Atlantis, he spoke of a city devoured by the ocean in a single day and night of misfortune? Atlantis may not have been Helike, but Helike proved the possibility. The line between allegory and reality blurred. Thera, the day the sky turned black. But Helike was not the only scar in memory. Centuries earlier, long before Plato, another disaster had reshaped the Aegean, the eruption of Thera. Today we call it Santorini, a crescent-shaped island of cliffs that plunge into blue. Tourists sip wine on terraces, watch sunsets over caldera, unaware they stand on the lip of a wound. But around 1600 BCE, Thera exploded. The volcano erupted with a force among the largest in recorded history. Ash shot miles into the sky, blotting out the sun. Pyroclastic flows swept across the island, erasing villages in moments. The sea boiled. And then came the tsunami's waves towering, racing outward, crashing into Crete, the heartland of the Minoan civilization. The Minoans were masters of the sea, traders, artists, builders of palaces adorned with frescoes of dolphins and lilies. They flourished for centuries, their ships ruling the Aegean. But after Thera, their strength withered. Crops failed under skies dimmed by ash. Ports were wrecked. Society fractured. Within a generation, the once great Minoan world had crumbled, leaving palaces abandoned, their pitted walls staring blankly into silence. For later Greeks, memory of this disaster may have lingered. Not as precise record, but as story, a great island, wealthy and advanced, undone by fire and flood. To Plato, writing 1,000 years later, could the whispers of Thera have mingled with his allegory? Atlantis, drowned by the sea, may carry in its veins the ash of Santorini. The flood myths. And beyond Thera, beyond Helice, there is something deeper, something almost primal, the flood. Nearly every culture carries a story of water rising, of humanity nearly undone. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of Utnapishtim, who survived a deluge sent by the gods. In Hebrew tradition, Noah builds an ark. In India, Manu is warned by a fish to prepare for a flood. In Native American stories, the earth is drowned and remade. Always the same shape: abundance, arrogance, punishment, water. Why? Perhaps because floods are universal. Rivers swell. Seas rise. Storms surge. To ancient peoples, these were not random accidents, they were cosmic warnings. And so, they preserve the memory, not in geology, but in story. Atlantis fits this pattern perfectly, a civilization flourishing, then drowned. It is not unique. It is part of a chorus. But Plato gave it marble detail, gave it walls and harbors and elephants. He took the archetype and dressed it in geography. Memory and imagination. Here is the paradox. Memory distorts, but it also preserves. An earthquake becomes a god's anger. A flood becomes a cosmic judgment. A volcanic eruption becomes fire from heaven. By the time Plato wrote, memories of disasters like Thera were centuries old. But their echoes survived in myths of floods, in whispers of drowned lands, in cautionary tales of hubris. Plato may have drawn on these echoes unconsciously. Or perhaps deliberately. He may have thought Athens too could fall. Let me show you a city greater than Athens, undone in a night. He may have thought of Helice. He may have heard older stories of islands swallowed by the sea. He may have woven them together into the allegory of Atlantis. That is why the tale feels both too detailed and too mythic. It is neither pure invention nor pure memory. It is the fusion of both. Catastrophe as teacher. For the ancients, disaster was never meaningless. A city destroyed was not just geology, it was judgment. Earthquakes meant the gods were angry. Floods meant humanity had strayed. To tell of catastrophe was to tell of morality. Atlantis, then, is not only a story of disaster. It is a story of punishment. Wealth breeds arrogance. Arrogance invites ruin. The gods do not tolerate pride. This lesson lies at the heart of nearly every flood myth, every tale of fire and water. Plato simply gave it a name, a city, a place beyond the pillars. The haunting realism. And yet, let us pause. Think of Hellike, its ruins visible under the sea. Think of Thera, its walls painted with frescoes still preserved in volcanic ash. Think of towns washed away by rivers, villages lost to storms. These are not allegories. They are real. They happened. And when we hear Atlantis described, when we imagine its fall, it feels real not because Plato was precise, but because we know the earth is capable of such cruelty. The genius of Atlantis is that it feels possible. Not because the geography is accurate, but because the memory of disaster lives in us. Fire, flood, and fragility. In the end, whether Atlantis was allegory or echo, its roots sink into the soil of catastrophe. Plato gave us a city that drowned. But the world had seen drowned cities. He gave us an empire undone. But the world had seen empires undone. What is Atlantis, if not the memory of fragility? The reminder that no matter how strong, how wealthy, how proud, civilizations stand on restless ground. Fire sleeps in mountains. The sea waits. Chapter 5. Utopia Across the Sea. When Plato wrote of Atlantis, he could not have imagined caravels. He could not have imagined sails billowing against Atlantic winds, or navigators charting stars to cross oceans. His tale was born in a world where the pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar, were the end of the map. Beyond lay only mystery. But by the 15th century, the map was stretching. The Renaissance had dawned, and Europe was rediscovering ancient texts. Plato's words, copied, translated, debated, found new life. In monasteries and libraries, thinkers read his description of Atlantis not as a forgotten parable, but as a puzzle. Beyond the pillars of Heracles lay the Atlantic, vast and unknown. What if Plato had been right? What if the lost island was out there, waiting to be found? And so the myth, once allegory, became geography. The rediscovery of Plato. In medieval Europe, much of Plato had been forgotten. Aristotle reigned supreme, Plato lingered in fragments. But the Renaissance brought a revival. Greek scholars, fleeing the fall of Constantinople, carried manuscripts westward. Humanists translated them into Latin, eager to drink from the source. Among these works were Timaeus and Critias. Suddenly, the tale of Atlantis was no longer a faint whisper. It was a rediscovered voice. For scholars steeped in biblical history, the idea of a drowned world resonated. Noah's flood was familiar, why not another? For explorers, the timing was electric. New ships, new instruments, and new ambitions were driving Europeans into the ocean. To read that beyond Gibraltar lay a great island, rich and fertile, was to read a tantalizing possibility. Atlantis was no longer only philosophy. It was a destination. Columbus and the Shadow of Atlantis. In 1492, Christopher Columbus stood on the brink of the unknown. His ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, were not mighty galleons but fragile wooden vessels. He sailed west, not knowing what he would find: India, Cipangu, Japan, or something else entirely. But in his notebooks, we glimpse the pull of Plato. Columbus read widely. He knew of Plato's account. He knew of classical geographers who speculated about islands in the Atlantic. When he set sail from Spain, he did not imagine empty ocean. He imagined lands, perhaps the remnants of Atlantis itself. Later, when he reached the Caribbean, he speculated he had found fragments of that lost world. To Europeans who followed, every island, Cuba, Hispaniola, the Bahamas, became a candidate. The New World was so strange, so fertile, so unlike Europe, that it seemed almost scripted by Plato. Gold, tropical abundance, peoples unknown to Europe, was this not the Atlantis of legend? Half drowned, half found? Maps and fantasies. Cartographers of the 16th century often filled the Atlantic with islands: Antillia, Hy Brasil, Street, Brendan's Isle. Some were born of sailors' errors, others of imagination, but all revealed a hunger for land in the West. Atlantis hovered like a ghost among them, unnamed but never absent. In Spain and Portugal, explorers spoke of golden cities and lush islands. echoes of Plato's fertile plains. In England, too, the idea took root not as history alone, but as possibility. Atlantis became a symbol of lands waiting to be discovered, a promise that the horizon itself was no longer a wall, but a door. Bacon's New Atlantis. And then, in 1627, came a book that transformed the myth. Francis Bacon, philosopher of science, wrote The New Atlantis. It was not about Plato's Atlantis directly, but the resonance was clear. Bacon imagined an island in the Pacific, Bensalem, where knowledge reigned, where science served society, where wisdom guided prosperity. It was a utopia of learning, a vision what a perfect society might be. By calling it New Atlantis, Bacon tethered his dream to Plato's myth. He inverted it. Where Plato's Atlantis was destroyed by arrogance, Bacon's Atlantis was elevated by virtue. Where Plato gave us a warning, Bacon gave us a blueprint. The effect was profound. Atlantis was no longer only a city that sank. It was a city that could be reborn. It was not just past, it was potential. The missionary and the myth. The Renaissance was also an age of conversion and conquest. Missionaries carried Christianity to the New World, but some whispered of older truths. If Atlantis had once existed, might its descendants still live in the Americas? Might the native peoples be heirs of Plato's drowned world? This idea was dangerous, shaping perceptions of the New World for centuries. It cast indigenous cultures not as independent and ancient, but as fragments of a lost European-like civilization. In this way, Atlantis became not only a dream but also a weapon used to frame conquest as rediscovery, plunder as reclamation. The dual faces of Atlantis. By the 17th century, Atlantis had two faces. One was utopia, Bacon's vision of science and virtue, explorers' hopes for fertile lands. The other was conquest, the justification that the New World was merely a fragment of a European dream, waiting to be claimed. Both faces were born of Plato's whisper, reshaped by Renaissance hunger. And both would endure. A world enchanted by loss. Why did Atlantis resonate so strongly in this age? Because the Renaissance was a time of rediscovery. Ancient texts returned. Ancient statues unearthed. Cities, long buried, revealed themselves to scholars. The past seemed alive, not dead. In such a world, the idea of a lost city beneath the sea was not absurd. It was natural. And beyond rediscovery lay longing. The Renaissance was dazzled by possibility, new knowledge, new lands, new wealth. But it was also haunted by nostalgia for a golden age, for a perfect society that had slipped away. Atlantis spoke to both, the paradise lost and the paradise yet to be found. The stage is set. By the end of the Renaissance, Atlantis had transformed. No longer just Plato's parable, it was now a quest, a dream of explorers, a canvas for philosophers. It had become geography and utopia, past and future. And it would not stop there. For the next centuries, poets and painters, dreamers and mystics would seize Atlantis and make it their own. It would become paradise, it would become nostalgia, it would become prophecy. And always, it would hover just out of reach, real enough to tempt, elusive enough to endure. The city that Plato sank was rising again, not from the sea, but from the imagination of a world learning to dream beyond its maps. Chapter 6. Romantic Longings. By the dawn of the 18th century, the age of discovery had changed the world forever. The Americas had been mapped, the great oceans crossed, new empires carved out across continents. The dream of Atlantis as land to be found began to fade. Explorers had scoured the Atlantic and returned with islands real but ordinary, fertile but not divine. The physical search slackened. But in its place grew something far more powerful, a longing. Atlantis began to slip its anchor from geography and set sail into the realm of imagination, art, and motion. The Age of Feeling. The 18th century gave birth to a new mood in Europe, Romanticism. The Romantics rejected cold rationalism, embracing instead the storm of human feeling awe before nature, nostalgia for the past, fascination with ruins, a yearning for worlds that could never quite be grasped. It was an age when poets wandered cliffs and wrote of oceans as if they were mirrors of the soul. Painters filled their canvases with storms, mountains, shipwrecks. Musicians filled their scores with longing, melancholy, ecstasy. And for all of them, Atlantis was irresistible. For what was Atlantis, if not the perfect romantic symbol? A world of beauty and abundance destroyed. A civilization brilliant, then lost. A story of fragility and longing, of something that can be imagined but never reached. Atlantis was not only a myth of destruction. It was a myth of yearning. Atlantis in poetry. Poets of the 18th and 19th centuries seized on Atlantis as metaphor. It appeared in verse as the land of memory, the kingdom of the deep, the sunken Eden. To speak of Atlantis was to speak of desire for what is gone, a lover lost, a childhood faded, a golden age slipped beneath the tide of history. Consider how Samuel Taylor Coleridge described the ocean as both vast and haunted, whispering with secrets. Lord Byron, restless and melancholic, found in the sea both terror and beauty. The idea of a drowned city beneath the waves spoke directly to this sensibility, something majestic, something terrifying, something forever out of reach. In German Romanticism, too, Atlantis emerged as symbol. Poets like Novalis and Schiller spoke of lost lands, of yearning for infinite horizons, of deep sea as metaphor for the human soul. Atlantis was no longer just a place. It was an inner landscape. Painters of the drowned world. Painters, too, were drawn to the vision. Canvases filled with storm-tossed ships, crumbling ruins, and horizons glowing with unnatural light. While few painted Atlantis directly, the imagery of a drowned world seeped into romantic art. Ruins became the obsession of the age. Artists sketched Gothic abbeys falling into ivy, Roman temples half buried, castles abandoned to the wind. To gaze upon ruins was to feel time itself as tangible. And what greater ruin than a city drowned? Atlantis became the ultimate ruin, invisible, unreachable, but felt. Its absence was more powerful than presence. Atlantis and music. Even music carried the myth. Composers spoke of sunken cathedrals, of harmonies rising like cities from water, then sinking back again. Debussy's La Cathédrale Ingloutie, though inspired by a Breton legend, not Atlantis itself embodies the same mood. Chords tolling like bells through deep water, the sense of something ancient rising briefly into sound before vanishing. The romantic ear, like the romantic eye, was tuned to Atlantis even when not naming it. It sang of it. The philosopher's Atlantis. Meanwhile, philosophers of the era reimagined Atlantis as part of the lost golden age. Motif. Jean-Jacques Rousseau spoke of the corruption of civilization, the purity of nature, the idea that humanity had fallen from a simpler, nobler past. Atlantis fit seamlessly, a civilization brilliant and then corrupted, punished by its own excess. In Germany, the philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder speculated on ancient cultures, lost continents, the diffusion of languages and peoples. Atlantis, again, hovered in the background, not only myth, but possible explanation for the spread of culture across oceans. The Romantic mind did not demand proof. It demanded resonance. Atlantis resonated deeply. A nostalgia for the impossible. What is nostalgia but longing for something gone? The Romantics elevated nostalgia into art, and Atlantis was its most potent symbol. To imagine Atlantis was to feel both awe and melancholy. Awe at its beauty, melancholy that it was forever unreachable. This duality gave the myth new life. Where Renaissance explorers sought to find Atlantis on maps, Romantic artists sought to find it in themselves, in dreams, in verses, in colors, in chords. Atlantis as paradise lost. Religious writers, too, folded Atlantis into older themes of Eden. Was Atlantis another Eden, destroyed for sin? Was it another Babel, punished for pride? In sermons and moral tracts, Atlantis became a way to speak of humanity's fall, not only the biblical one, but the continual cycle of greatness and ruin. It is no accident that John Milton's Paradise Lost and Plato's Atlantis share a structure: glory undone by pride, beauty destroyed by arrogance, loss that echoes eternally. For romantic minds, Atlantis was Eden under the sea. Science and myth intertwined. By the 19th century, science itself was shifting. Geology was emerging as a discipline. Fossils were discovered, strata studied, the Earth revealed to be far older than once believed. Catastrophism, the theory that sudden disasters had shaped the world, found eager adherents. Floods, eruptions, upheavals, these seemed to match Atlantis perfectly. Even serious scientists speculated. Could there have been a lost land in the Atlantic? Could ancient memory preserve real catastrophe? The lines between science, poetry, and myth blurred. A world ready for Donnelly. This romantic obsession, this mingling of science and nostalgia, set the stage for the next chapter in Atlantis's life, Ignatius Donnelly. His 1882 book Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, would take the longing and give it form, arguing that Atlantis was not just symbol but history, the mother of all civilizations. Without the Romantic century, without its poets, painters, dreamers, and philosophers, Donnelly's book would never have ignited such fire. Atlantis was already glowing, a symbol on every tongue. He only fanned it into flame. The power of longing. And so, in the 18th and 19th centuries, Atlantis became more than myth. It became longing itself. Not a land to be found, but a dream to be felt. A ruin, unseen, yet more powerful than any ruin of stone. The city beneath the waves had become a mirror of the human soul, brilliant, fragile, haunted by loss. And in that mirror, entire generations saw themselves. Chapter 7. The Book That Ignited the World. The year was 1882. The United States was surging with energy, railroads stitching across the continent, telegraphs buzzing, factories humming. Europe, too, was transforming, science pushing boundaries, Darwin unsettling faith, archaeology peeling back the ancient world. It was an age of confidence and anxiety. The modern world was racing forward, but people still longed for roots, for origins, for answers to mysteries the new machines could not explain. Into this world stepped Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, a man with restless ambition, a taste for grand visions, and a pen that could inflame imagination. He would not just write about Atlantis. He would resurrect it. The man behind the myth. Donnelly was an American politician, lawyer, and writer born in 1831, raised in Pennsylvania, later a congressman in Minnesota. He was intelligent, charismatic, and always chasing causes larger than himself. He fought for farmers' rights, railed against corruption, and dreamed of reform. But his greatest legacy would not be political speeches. It would be his books. Donnelly had a gift. He could take complex, speculative, half-formed ideas and wrap them in prose so persuasive, so confident, that readers felt they were being handed truth. He was not a careful scholar. He was a visionary salesman. And in 1882, he turned his gaze toward Atlantis. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The book appeared under a title that promised revelation: Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It was not a modest claim. Antediluvian meant before the flood. Donnelly was not content to argue that Atlantis had existed. He argued that it was the mother civilization of all the world. The central thesis was bold. Atlantis was a vast continent in the middle of the Atlantic. It was the cradle of human civilization. From Atlantis spread agriculture, metallurgy, religion, language, art. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, all were colonies or echoes of Atlantis. The flood described in the Bible, in Mesopotamian myth, in countless traditions, was the memory of Atlantis's destruction. In one sweep, Donnelly explained the mysteries of the world. Why did pyramids appear in both Egypt and Mexico? Atlantis. Why did myths of floods appear across cultures? Atlantis. Why did civilizations separated by oceans share symbols, gods, or technologies? Atlantis. It was intoxicating. A book for its time. Donnelly's book struck at precisely the right moment. Archaeology was booming but confusing. Scholars were uncovering ruins in Mesopotamia, tombs in Egypt, temples in Mesoamerica. Languages were being deciphered, artifacts catalogued. But the pieces did not yet fit together. There was no coherent story of how civilizations had arisen. Donnelly offered one. He wove together fragments: myth, geology, linguistics, archaeology into a grand narrative. To the lay reader, it was irresistible. A world explained, a mystery solved. To skeptics, it was pseudoscience, built on speculation and weak evidence. But to millions, it felt like revelation. The rhetoric of certainty. Part of the book's power lay in Donnelly's style. He wrote not as a cautious academic, but as a prophet. He presented speculation as fact, possibilities as inevitabilities. He marshaled quotations, maps, diagrams, mythological parallels, all arranged with an air of inevitability. He knew his audience wanted wonder. He gave them wonder, wrapped in authority. His words were a bridge between science and imagination, reason and romance. He sounded like a scholar, but spoke like a poet. The explosion of Atlantis mania. The book became a sensation. Translated, reprinted, debated, it spread across Europe and the Americas. Newspapers serialized it. Societies debated it. Readers devoured it. Suddenly, Atlantis was no longer a philosopher's allegory or a poet's symbol. It was everywhere. Atlantis appeared in novels, plays, operas. Journalists speculated on discoveries. Explorers proposed expeditions. Amateurs pored over maps, convinced they saw hints of sunken lands. The idea seeped into popular culture so thoroughly that for many, it became almost common knowledge. Of course, Atlantis had existed. Of course, it was the source of all civilizations. Atlantis mania was born. The criticism. Scholars, of course, recoiled. Donnelly's evidence was weak, his logic circular, his conclusions sweeping. He cherry-picked myths, ignored contradictions, forced connections. Linguists pointed out errors. Archaeologists dismissed him. But criticism only fueled fascination. Readers loved him precisely because he challenged the establishment. Donnelly's Atlantis was not academic. It was democratic, a story for everyone, not just professors. The legacy of Donnelly. The impact of Donnelly's book cannot be overstated. He transformed Atlantis from obscure myth into cultural phenomenon. Without him, Atlantis might have remained a footnote in Plato, a curiosity for philosophers. With him, it became a living legend, embedded in the modern imagination. And Donnelly did not stop with Atlantis. He later wrote Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, speculating about comet impacts shaping history. He flirted with Shakespearean conspiracy theories. Always the same pattern: grand claims, sweeping narratives, irresistible prose. But Atlantis was his masterpiece. It set the stage for everything that followed: mystics, occultists, pseudoscientists, novelists, filmmakers. Nearly every modern vision of Atlantis as mother civilization, as technological utopia, as drowned paradise traces back to Donnelly's 1882 book. A myth reborn. If Plato lit the spark, Donnelly poured gasoline on it. From this point forward, Atlantis would never again be just allegory. It would never again be confined to philosophy. It was reborn as obsession, as quest, as cultural icon. In the Romantic Age, Atlantis had been a metaphor for longing. After Donnelly, it was fact to be proven, continent to be rediscovered, history to be rewritten. He made it live again, and the world would not let it sink. Chapter 8: Prophets and Mystics of the Deep. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were an age of paradox. Science was advancing faster than ever: electricity, telephones, airplanes, X-rays, Darwin's theory of evolution. Yet alongside the laboratories and universities grew something else, a hunger for mystery, for spirit, for invisible worlds science could not touch. Seances filled parlors. Ghost societies multiplied. Mediums claimed to speak for the dead. And in this climate of mysticism, Atlantis found new life. It ceased to be only a sunken continent of stone. It became a spiritual homeland, a lost Eden of the soul. Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Atlantis. At the heart of this transformation stood one of the most controversial figures of the 19th century, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, co-founder of the Theosophical Society. Born in Russia in 1831, Blavatsky was a traveler, writer, and self-styled mystic. In 1875, she founded the Theosophical Society in New York, later moving its center to India. Her writings, particularly The Secret Doctrine, 1888, sought to blend Eastern religions, Western esotericism, and a sweeping cosmic history of humanity. And in her story of human origins, Atlantis loomed large. Blavatsky taught that humanity had passed through a series of root races, vast epochs of spiritual and physical evolution. According to her, the Atlanteans were the fourth root race, powerful, psychic, technologically advanced, but ultimately corrupted by pride. Their continent had been destroyed, she claimed, tens of thousands of years ago. Yet their descendants lived on, shaping later civilizations. This was not Plato's allegory. It was a cosmic saga, Atlantis as both prehistory and prophecy, a spiritual warning about hubris and decline. Blavatsky's Atlantis appealed to a world caught between faith and science. It offered a grand, mysterious prehistory that explained human diversity, ancient myths, and spiritual longing. It wove Atlantis into a tapestry of karma, reincarnation, and evolution of the soul. Theosophy's influence. Blavatsky's followers spread her teachings across Europe, India, and America. Theosophy attracted artists, intellectuals, seekers among them, W.B. Yeats, Kandinsky, and early feminists. Atlantis became not merely a myth, but a framework for spiritual history. In Theosophy, Atlantis was no longer lost forever. It lived in memory, in dreams, in the soul's journey. Some adepts claimed to recall past lives in Atlantis. Others spoke of its libraries of wisdom, its crystal technologies, its priests who misused power. For Theosophists, Atlantis was both cautionary tale and spiritual homeland. Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet. If Blavatsky intellectualized Atlantis, another figure brought it to the masses, Edgar Cayce. Born in Kentucky in 1877, Cayce was a modest, church-going man who discovered, to his own astonishment, that he could enter a trance and speak with uncanny knowledge. dubbed the sleeping prophet. He gave thousands of readings on health, spirituality, and destiny. And Atlantis became one of his recurring themes. In Trance, Casey described Atlantis as a vast continent in the Atlantic, home to a technologically advanced people who harnessed energies of crystals and sound. He claimed the Atlanteans had flying machines, death rays, and psychic powers. Their civilization, he said, fell in stages, first around 50,000 BCE, then again around 28,000 BCE, and finally swallowed by the sea in 10,000 BCE. But Casey did not speak only of the past. He prophesied the future. He claimed Atlantis would rise again, that evidence of it would emerge near the Bahamas, that the world would see its return in the 20th century. He even told some of his clients that they had lived past lives in Atlantis, their present struggles echoing ancient karmic debts. Casey's Atlantis was mystical, moral, and urgent. It warned of technological hubris. It promised spiritual awakening. And it offered believers a sense of cosmic destiny. Crystals, energy, and lost technology. Through Blavatsky and Casey, Atlantis became tied to the language of energy, vibration, and crystals. The idea that Atlanteans used giant crystals to harness power, solar, cosmic, psychic, captured imaginations. It echoed both ancient myth and modern science fiction. For spiritual seekers, crystals became relics of that lost wisdom, tools for healing, meditation, and energy work. Atlantis was no longer just ruins beneath the sea. It was a symbol of untapped human potential, of technologies of the spirit forgotten by a materialist age. Atlantis and race theories. But here, too, the mystic Atlantis carried dangers. Blavatsky's root race theory, though framed in spiritual evolution, was easily twisted into racial hierarchy. Some claimed the Atlanteans were an ancient Aryan people, superior and destined to return. Such ideas would later feed into darker ideologies, including Nazi mythologies of a master race from a lost northern homeland. Thus, even in the mystical realm, Atlantis carried double edges, inspiration and distortion, hope and danger. Popular culture and the psychic Atlantis. By the early 20th century, Atlantis had become a fixture not just of occult circles, but of popular imagination. Novels described Atlantean priests, submarines discovering ruins, crystals humming with power. Spiritualists spoke of channeled messages from Atlanteans, still guiding humanity. Even comic strips and pulp magazines filled their pages with Atlantean adventures. The power of Atlantis lay in its adaptability. To Plato, it was allegory. To Donnelly, it was history. To Blavatsky and Casey, it was prophecy and memory. It could be scientific or spiritual, political or mystical, rational or fantastic. It was endlessly reshaped to fit the hunger of the age. The deeper meaning. Why did Atlantis find such a home in mysticism? Because it touched something primal. It was the story of a people greater than ourselves, undone by pride, yet leaving behind a trace of glory. It was both tragedy and hope, the tragedy of loss, the hope of recovery. For seekers in a world of rapid change, Atlantis offered roots in a cosmic story. For those disillusioned with materialism, it offered a vision of forgotten wisdom. For those yearning for destiny, it offered prophecy. And so, in the hands of prophets and mystics, Atlantis became not just a lost city. It became a mirror of the soul, a warning and a promise. A myth transformed. By the mid-20th century, Atlantis had journeyed far from Plato's dialogues. It had become a spiritual homeland, a stage for reincarnation, a laboratory of lost science, a prophecy of things to come. It had become, in short, anything people needed it to be. The philosophers had whispered of hubris. The explorers had sought islands. The poets had sighed for paradise lost. Donnelly had claimed the mother of civilizations. Blavatsky and Casey had promised prophecy, energy, and destiny. The myth was no longer one thing. It was everything. Chapter 9. When Myths Become Dangerous. The trouble with myths is not that they are false. It is that they are flexible. Atlantis had already been philosophers' allegory, explorers' dream, poets' metaphor, mystics' homeland. But in the early 20th century, amid nationalism, war, and racial theory, Atlantis would become something far darker, the myth of origins, purity, and supremacy. A fertile soil for myth. The 19th century ended with Europe at the height of its power empires, stretched across continents. Science and industry promised limitless growth. But beneath the triumph lay unease. Darwin had shaken the foundation of belief. The world felt older, stranger. Archaeologists were unearthing civilizations more ancient than the Bible. Where had humanity begun? How had civilizations risen and fallen? In this climate, Atlantis offered an intoxicating story, a mother civilization, a pure origin, a lost homeland. But who were its heirs? Who were its chosen descendants? It was only a matter of time before someone claimed the answer. Atlantis and the Aryan myth. The figure most responsible for this dark transformation was not a politician but a mystic turned racial theorist. Helena Blavatsky had already given the world the root race theory, with Atlanteans as one stage in humanity's spiritual evolution. But her followers and interpreters twisted this into something else, a hierarchy of races, some more advanced, others degenerate. From there, it was a short step to link Atlantis with the so-called Aryan race. If Atlantis had been the cradle of civilization, then perhaps the Aryans were its heirs. Perhaps they carried the flame of a purer, older people. Writers like Guido von List, Jorg Lans von Liebenfels, and later Alfred Roseberg, Nazi ideologue, fused Atlantis with Nordic myths of a northern homeland, Tula, Hyperborea, Ultima Thule. Suddenly, the lost island was not just Plato's allegory but the supposed birthplace of a master race. The Nazis and the search for origins. Adolf Hitler and his circle were obsessed with origins and destiny. They scoured myth, archaeology, and pseudoscience for proof of Aryan superiority. The myth of Atlantis slipped easily into this obsession. The Nazi think tank, Anna Nirbe, Ancestral Heritage Research Institute funded expeditions searching for traces of ancient homelands, Tibet, the Arctic, even the seafloor. While Atlantis was not always mentioned explicitly, its echo was present. The idea of a drowned land, a lost race, a primal origin of Aryan power. In the propaganda of the time, Atlantis mingled with Norse sagas, racial pseudoscience, and dreams of empire. The lost city, once a warning of hubris, had been inverted into a justification for conquest. Myth as weapon. Here's the tragedy. Atlantis had always carried a warning. Plato's tale was not celebration, but caution, a city destroyed by arrogance, by pride. But in the 20th century, the myth was rewritten as destiny. The fall was forgotten, only the glory remembered. In Nazi ideology, Atlantis became a symbol of a glorious origin stolen by catastrophe, a catastrophe that the Reich would avenge, a destiny it would reclaim. The drowned city was not a warning of ruin, but a promise of rebirth. This is the danger of myths. They are mirrors. They reflect not truth, but desire. And when desire turns dark, so does the reflection. Beyond the Reich. It was not only Germany. Across Europe and America, fringe writers linked Atlantis to racial theories, eugenics, and nationalist myths. Atlantis was invoked to argue that civilization flowed from Europe outward, that non-European cultures were only echoes of a lost white homeland. Thus, what had begun as a Greek allegory became a weapon of colonialism, racism, and exclusion. The same myth that inspired poets and mystics was bent into a sword. The aftermath. After World War II, the association of Atlantis with Nazi myth left a bitter aftertaste. Scholars recoiled even more strongly from the idea. To speak seriously of Atlantis now risked being lumped with pseudoscience and extremism. Yet in popular culture, Atlantis did not die. It returned in novels, films, comics, and spiritual circles, but now often stripped of overt racial ideology. The myth was too powerful to vanish. It simply shifted shape again. The lesson of Chapter 9. This chapter of Atlantis' history is a warning in itself. Myths are never neutral. They are clay, reshaped by each generation. They can inspire wonder, longing, exploration. But they can also be twisted into poison. Atlantis began as a parable of hubris. But in the wrong hands, it became a parable of purity and power. The drowned city, instead of teaching humility, was used to justify arrogance. And that may be the greatest irony of all, that a myth meant to warn against pride was used to crown it. Chapter 10. Cities that sleep beneath the sea. The ocean is not empty. Beneath its surface lie ghost cities, forgotten harbors, whole worlds abandoned to the tide. Some are faint shadows of foundations. Others are astonishingly intact, their streets still traceable, their walls still standing. Each of them whispers the same truth: Atlantis is not unique. Civilizations do sink. Pavlopatri, the Greek Atlantis. The southern coast of Laconia, Greece. The water here is shallow, turquoise, shimmering in the Mediterranean sun. For centuries, fishermen noticed strange stones beneath the waves. Only in 1967 did archaeologists finally map them. What they found was astonishing. Pavlopatri, a city more than 5,000 years old, lying beneath just 3 meters of water. Streets still ran straight and narrow. Foundations of houses, courtyards, even larger public buildings stretched across 20 acres. Pottery fragments revealed a society connected to the wider Aegean, trading, thriving, then undone. No volcanic fire or sudden wave seems to have destroyed Pavlopatri. Instead, slow geological subsidence, creeping sea levels, and earthquakes over centuries drowned it piece by piece. Yet when divers swim above it, the effect is uncanny. It is as though an entire community had paused in time, waiting. Pavlopatry is sometimes called the real Atlantis. It lacks the grandeur of Plato's description, but it has something more powerful: reality. It shows us that cities do not always vanish in myth. They sink, and they endure. Heraklion, the Egyptian port. Now let us turn to Egypt, to the mouth of the Nile. For centuries, legends spoke of a great port city named Heraklion, or Atlantis, where Heracles was once worshipped, where Helen of Troy and Paris supposedly stopped before their fateful flight. Ancient texts mentioned it, but no one knew where it had gone. Then, in 2000, French underwater archaeologist Franck Gaudiot and his team uncovered it beneath the waters of Aboukir Bay. The discovery stunned the world. Massive statues of pharaohs and gods lay half-buried in silt. Temples, docks, shipwrecks, coins, jewelry, a whole city lost beneath the waves for 1,200 years. Earthquakes and unstable delta soil had dragged it down, the sea swallowing what the Nile could not support. Today, divers swim past colossal stone heads, their eyes blind but noble, resting in silence. The city that had been a hub of commerce between Egypt and the Mediterranean is now a memory underwater. If Plato's readers had needed proof that a metropolis could vanish into the sea, Heraklion could have provided it. Dwarka, the city of Krishna. Across the world, off the coast of India, lies another legend made real. Hindu texts spoke of Dwarka, the city of Krishna, built of gold, jewels, and palaces, which sank into the sea after his death. For centuries, it was dismissed as myth. But in the early 2000s, marine archaeologists exploring off the coast of Gujarat discovered submerged structures, walls, and artifacts dating back thousands of years. Stone blocks, anchors, pottery, evidence of human settlement now deep beneath the water. The discoveries are still debated. Are these truly ancient urban remains, or natural formations adapted by humans? Yet, the resonance is powerful. An Indian Atlantis, echoing Plato's tale but rooted in its own mythology. Once again, the boundary blurs between story and ruin, faith and archaeology. Yonaguni, the Japanese mystery. Then there is Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan's Ryukyu Islands. Discovered by divers in 1986, it is a vast series of stone formations, terraces, steps, and platforms rising from the seabed. Some claim it is natural, sandstone eroded into geometric shapes. Others insist it is artificial, an ancient city built thousands of years ago. Swimmers glide past what looks like stairways, plazas, even pyramids. If it is man-made, it rewrites history. If it is natural, it shows how easily the mind sees ruins in stone. Either way, Yonaguni carries the aura of Atlantis, half fact, half imagination, a riddle waiting to be solved beneath the waves. The science of submersion. What ties these cities together is not magic, but geology. The Earth shifts. Sea levels rise. Deltas sink. Earthquakes tear coasts apart. Tsunamis strike without warning. What seems eternal can vanish overnight or inch by inch across centuries. In the last ice age, seas were hundreds of feet lower. As glaciers melted, coastlines flooded, submerging countless settlements. Many more Pavlopetris and Heraklions must lie hidden beneath the sea, their stories untold. Atlantis, then, is not implausible. Its grandeur may be exaggerated, its history mythologized, but its premise, a great city swallowed by the sea, is real. It has happened again and again. The emotional power of ruins. And yet, when divers surface from Pavlopetri or Heraklion, they speak not only of science but of awe. To glide through streets where people once lived, to see a statue staring upward through green water, is to feel time collapse. This is why Atlantis will not die. Because beneath the waves lie real Atlantean echoes. They prove the myth possible. They haunt the imagination. They remind us that our cities, too, stand on fragile ground. A mirror for the future. Today, as seas rise once more not from gods or earthquakes, but from our own industry, the drowned cities of the past take on new meaning. Pavlopetri, Heraklion, Dwarka, Yonaguni, they are not only ruins. They are warnings. They tell us that water remembers. That no civilization, however proud, is immune. That Plato's parable may not be allegory alone. It may be prophecy. Chapter 11, Atlantis, Reborn in Culture. Atlantis is not a city anymore. It is a stage. By the 20th century, the scholarly debates, the mystics' prophecies, even the Nazis' appropriation could not contain the myth. Atlantis broke free, flowing into the bloodstream of popular culture. It became a story anyone could tell, anyone could shape, from pulp writers to animators, from comic book artists to Hollywood directors. Atlantis in early pulp fiction. The 1920s and 1930s were the golden age of pulp magazines. Cheap paper, bold covers, endless adventure. Atlantis was everywhere. Writers imagined submarines discovering glowing ruins, Atlantean survivors ruling secret kingdoms, crystal weapons, and death rays hidden beneath the sea. In these tales, Atlantis was not dead. It was alive, waiting. Sometimes its people were noble sages, keepers of wisdom. Sometimes they were tyrants, planning to reclaim the surface world. The sunken city became the perfect backdrop, exotic, mysterious, half science, half magic. Pulp fiction cemented Atlantis as adventure fuel, as flexible as needed, as thrilling as possible. Disney's Atlantis, The Lost Empire. Fast forward to 2001. Disney released Atlantis, The Lost Empire, a film unlike its fairy tale musicals. Influenced by Jules Verne and steampunk aesthetics, it imagined Atlantis not as ruins, but as a living city powered by crystals. The film gave us glowing towers, flying machines, an Atlantean language invented by linguist Mark Okrand, who also created Klingon for Star Trek. It was a commercial gamble, darker, stranger, more complex than typical Disney fare. Though it underperformed at the box office, it became a cult classic, showing how Atlantis could be reimagined for a new generation. Disney's Atlantis was both futuristic and ancient, a civilization that never really died, waiting beneath the sea with secrets of energy and wisdom. Atlantis in comics. Atlantis also found a permanent home in comic books. In DC Comics, Atlantis is the kingdom of Aquaman, a warrior king ruling a sprawling undersea empire. In Marvel Comics, it is the realm of Namor the Submariner, half human, half Atlantean, proud and tempestuous. Both characters embody Atlantis as more than ruins, a living civilization, technologically advanced, often in conflict with the surface world. These Atlantean stories reflected 20th century anxieties and dreams, the clash between nature and industry, isolation and integration, ancient wisdom and modern hubris. Through Aquaman and Namor, millions came to know Atlantis, not through Plato, but through comic panels. Science fiction and Atlantis. Atlantis flourished in science fiction too. Writers wove it into tales of alien intervention, time travel, or parallel worlds. Some imagined Atlanteans as aliens themselves, their city a crashed starship disguised as myth. Others made Atlantis a future city not lost in the past, but yet to come, a utopia that would rise when humanity was ready. In H.P. Lovecraft's universe, echoes of Atlantis appeared as R'lyeh, the drowned city of Cthulhu. Though distinct, it carried the same mood, vast alien ruins beneath the sea, haunted by beings older than man. Lovecraft took Atlantis's aura of awe and twisted it into cosmic dread. Atlantis, in cinema and television. Atlantis lit up cinema screens again and again. Atlantis, the Lost Continent, 1961, blended melodrama with myth. TV series like Stargate, Atlantis reimagined the city as an interstellar outpost, blending science fiction and mythology. Even documentaries, half scientific, half sensational, filled late-night television, promising to reveal the real Atlantis through underwater footage and dramatic narration. For many viewers, Atlantis became less a story than a permanent question mark. Could it still be out there, waiting? Atlantis in video games. With the rise of video games, Atlantis found new digital lives. Players explored it in Tomb Raider, Assassin's Creed, Odyssey, and countless fantasy RPGs. Each game reimagined it, sometimes ruins, sometimes empire, sometimes alien technology. The interactivity gave Atlantis something new, not just a place to imagine, but a place to explore, to walk through, to conquer. In digital worlds, Atlantis is endlessly reborn. Why pop culture loves Atlantis? Why does Atlantis thrive in popular culture? Because it is infinitely adaptable. As utopia, it can be paradise, wise and shining. As dystopia, it can be corrupt, tyrannical, destroyed by its own sins. As adventure, it is a playground for submarines, ruins, explorers. As allegory, it can symbolize ecological collapse, imperial hubris, lost innocence. As fantasy, it can hold crystals, aliens, or gods. It is not tied to one genre. It belongs to all. A city that refuses to die. What makes Atlantis unique among myths is not just its imagery, the rings of canals, the shining temples, the sudden flood. It is its resilience. Other myths are fixed. Troy burned, Camelot fell, Eden closed. Atlantis shifts shape endlessly. It dies in one story, survives in another, becomes alien in a third, digital in a fourth. The city that sank has lived longer than any that stood. The cultural mirror. And through all these reinventions, Atlantis remains a mirror. In the Cold War, it became a parable of civilizations undone by weapons. In the environmental age, it became a warning of rising seas. In an age of superheroes, it became a kingdom of power. In an age of nostalgia, it became paradise lost. Each generation resurrects the city it needs. Each paints Atlantis in its own image. Chapter 12: The Eternal Mirror. The sea is quiet now. It always is, in the end. Waves roll, tides shift, but the ocean keeps its secrets. Somewhere beneath its surface lie ruins Pavlopetri, Heraklion, Dwarka cities that once rang with voices, now silent. Somewhere in our imagination lies another, Atlantis. And still we ask, was it real? Perhaps the better question is, why do we need it to be real? The myth that refuses to drown. Atlantis is not like other myths. Troy was rediscovered. Babylon stood in bricks. Eden remains in faith. But Atlantis is different. It shifts, adapts, refuses to die. Plato wrote it as a warning. Renaissance explorers saw it as geography. Romantics saw it as longing. Donnelly saw it as history. Mystics saw it as prophecy. Nazis saw it as origin. Archaeologists see its echoes in drowned cities. Pop culture paints it anew in every medium. The city has sunk 1,000 times and risen 1,000 more. The human ache for origins. One reason Atlantis endures is because it speaks to our hunger for origins. We want to know where we came from. Not just individually, but as a species, as a civilization. Every culture carries myths of first gardens, first homelands, first cities. Atlantis is the most alluring of them all, not because it explains where we began, but because it promises there was more. Something greater, something wiser, something lost. A missing chapter in the story of humanity. The warning we keep forgetting. Another reason, Atlantis is a parable we cannot ignore. Plato's point was clear: hubris destroys civilizations. Power breeds arrogance. Arrogance invites downfall. And yet we keep telling the story, as if rehearsing it over and over might finally help us listen. In the age of climate change, rising seas, and fragile cities, Atlantis feels less like legend and more like prophecy. We, too, are building empires of glittering towers. We, too, are pushing against the limits of the earth. We, too, may one day be remembered, if at all, as a civilization that drowned itself. Perhaps Atlantis endures not because it was real, but because it might be. The city within us. But Atlantis is not only caution. It is also longing. A yearning for paradise, for wisdom, for a place where beauty and knowledge once thrived. It is nostalgia for something we never truly had, but wish we did. Every time we imagine Atlantis, we are imagining ourselves, our hopes, our regrets, our fears, our dreams. The drowned city is less a place than a mirror. And in that mirror, each age sees a different face. Plato saw arrogance undone. Columbus saw a world to be found. Romantics saw paradise lost. Donnelly saw origins. Blavatsky saw prophecy. Nazis saw destiny. We see fragility, memory, rising seas. Atlantis is eternal because it is never the same. The ocean's whisper. Stand at the shore at night. Listen to the waves. The sea is not empty. It is a vast archive. Every storm, every flood, every drowned village lies somewhere in its depths. We know there are cities beneath it. We know the ocean keeps ruins. So when we imagine Atlantis, we are not imagining the impossible. We are listening to the ocean's whisper. I have taken cities before. I will take them again. The eternal mirror. Atlantis may never be found. Not because it does not exist, but because it exists everywhere in memory, in longing, in warning. It is not one city. It is all cities. It is us. Plato ended his unfinished dialogue Critias mid-sentence, as if the story itself had drowned. That is fitting. Atlantis is always unfinished. Always sinking, always rising, always waiting. And so the myth endures. Not because of what it tells us about the past, but because of what it tells us about the present and what it dares us to ask about the future. When the sea rises, when the ground trembles, when the towers of our cities one day fall, what stories will survive of us? What name will our ruins bear? And will some future philosopher, thousands of years from now, tell of a great people, proud and clever, who built wonders until the sea swallowed them? Perhaps they will not call it Atlantis. Perhaps they will simply call it us. Epilogue: the sea will take us too. Night falls on the shoreline. The horizon fades into indigo, and the tide murmurs against the sand. You stand there, listening. Not just to the water, but to the weight of time. For thousands of years, the ocean has been swallowing, reshaping, erasing, and remembering. Somewhere beneath its surface lie broken temples, collapsed walls, coins crusted with coral. And always, the imagination whispers, perhaps Atlantis lies there too. But if we are honest, the question is not only whether Atlantis was real. The question is whether we are. The living parable. Plato's story was not about the sea. It was about us. He told of a civilization, brilliant, wealthy, powerful a civilization, that forgot humility, that reached too far and was punished. In that sense, Atlantis is not just history or myth. It is parable. And parables do not age. They wait, like shadows, until the world proves them true again. The drowned city, whether it ever existed or not, stands as a mirror. We look into it and see ourselves, our ambition, our beauty, our arrogance, our fragility. The real Atlanteans. Walk through New York, London, Tokyo, Shanghai. Look up at towers of steel and glass, at harbors glowing with lights, at streets that never sleep. The pride of Atlantis was not greater. And yet, as the seas rise again not by gods, but by the warming of the earth itself, we begin to understand. Miami floods on sunny days. Venice drowns in tides. Jakarta sinks inch by inch. Cyclones carve coastlines. Islands vanish. We are not waiting to discover Atlantis. We are becoming it. The silence of ruins. Every drowned city we have found, Pavlopetri, Heraklion, Dwarka, speaks softly of how fragile greatness is. They were not myths. They were homes. Streets where children played, harbors where ships unloaded, temples where prayers rose. Now they are silent. When divers swim above them, the sight is haunting. The geometry of streets beneath green water. Statues staring upward through centuries of silt. Silence where once there was life. To see them is to feel time as tide, relentless, patient, erasing. One day, perhaps, divers will swim above our ruins too. Why Atlantis endures? So why does the story endure? Because it tells two things at once. That we once came from something greater, a paradise lost. And that we may, by our own hubris, lose everything again. It comforts and it warns. It tempts and it chastises. It is both dream and nightmare. It is, in the end, eternal, because it is not about a place. It is about us. The last question. Plato left his Critias unfinished, the dialogue ending mid-sentence, as if the story itself had drowned. Perhaps that was fitting. Atlantis was never meant to be completed. It was meant to be rediscovered again and again, by each generation in its own way. And so it is. Renaissance explorers, romantic poets, pseudoscientists, mystics, dictators, filmmakers all found their Atlantis. We will too. Perhaps we already have. But as you listen to the waves at night, remember, the myth has teeth. It is not only fantasy. The earth has swallowed cities before. The sea has taken them. It will take more. When it does, what story will be told of us? The sea will take us too. In the end, Atlantis is not only behind us. It is ahead of us. A reminder that every city is temporary. That the ocean waits. That time is patient. Perhaps Atlantis never existed. Perhaps it did. But one day, inevitably, we will. We will be the city that drowned. The civilization remembered in fragments. The whispers beneath the tide. And some future philosopher, writing in the ruins of tomorrow, will tell the story of a people who built wonders, who mastered fire and steel, who thought themselves eternal until the sea rose and the night swallowed them. And that story will not be called Atlantis. It will be called us.